All right, so welcome to our invasive species webinar series. This is part 7 of 8, and we are going to cover invasive coastal plants today with our guest speaker. Next. I'm Dr. Catherine Clements. I'm the Ecology and Natural Resources Educator here at University of Florida IFAS Extension in Sarasota County. I am a native Buffalonian, so I grew up in Western New York, spent a lot of my time out in nature, and have an undergraduate degree in environmental studies from State University of New York at Buffalo. I did that for a while and then transitioned into becoming a physician and practiced integrative medicine for about 12 years. And then 5 years ago, I decided to come full circle and come back to environmental education and took the position that I'm currently in. So I do a lot of wildlife education, native and invasive plant education, obviously, and work with both youth and adults in my role here at UF IFAS Extension. Next. And I'll let Armando introduce himself. He is our guest speaker today.
Good morning and welcome. As Catherine said, I'm Armando Silva. I'm the Sea Grant Agent in the Extension Office here in Sarasota, which means I am the Marine and Coastal Agent. So I'm a marine biologist. That's my background. I'm actually not a botanist, so I will be talking about plants, but that's not my strength. Although I do a lot of work with plants because I do care about water quality, quantity, nutrients, wildlife, so it's related, and I'll explain that more later. But anyway, my background is in marine biology. I have a master's degree from Oregon State on marine resource management. So again, dealing with natural resources and the stakeholders. I've done a lot of research, mainly behavior ecology with sharks, sea turtles, manatees, coral reef as well, communities. And at the current moment, not only am I an agent, but also I'm enrolled back in graduate school. So I'm getting my PhD in wildlife ecology and conservation. So that's me in a nutshell. And I'm happy to be here. So I'm going to pass it back to Catherine.
And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what is Extension in case you are not familiar with Extension. And Extension is a partnership between our county and the University of Florida and the USDA. And there is an Extension office associated with each of our 67 counties here in Florida. And there are also Extension offices in every state in our country. And the mission of Extension is to use the research and resources of the state's land grant university to address local needs through community initiatives, classes, outreach, and volunteer opportunities. So we are an educational facility, and we provide that practical education to help our residents, the professionals, and our decision makers to build a better future for our county. Next. And so these are many of the things we do. We have programming in all of these areas. The Sarasota County Extension is quite a robust extension office. So we have lots of information and resources to offer you. So if there is anything in these areas that we could assist you with, please reach out to either myself or Armando, but certainly also just to our extension office in general. Next. These are some of the logos of the programs that we offer through our office. So Armando and I are both involved in the Florida Master Naturalist Program, which is up there in the right-hand corner. That's an excellent program for adult education about Florida's ecosystems. And of course, our Master Gardeners are a huge part of our volunteer force that provides education information to our community about landscaping, edible gardening, but also about invasive plants or alternatives to invasive plants that you can plant in your yard. So we have a plant clinic at our office Monday through Thursday. Please reach out to them if they can help you in any way. You can come in or email or call them. Next. So this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to do our basic introductory information about invasive species. So if you've joined us for any of our other presentations, that's going to be a little bit of a repeat. Although really important information, we want to make sure we cover it for anybody that's joining us for the first time. We're going to talk about the impacts of invasive species. We're going to talk about some of the regulatory and informational agencies that are involved in invasive species. And then Armando will be covering some of that, but also be covering specific species that are found along our coastal environments. And then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. Next. So let's talk a little bit about definitions that are relevant to in our invasive species world. Invasive species terminology, next, has it's had a lot of different words that are used for some of the same things. So in June of 2020, University of Florida professors, some of our extension agents, published this paper where the intent was to try to standardize some of the terminology around this issue so that people are using the same words to refer to the same things, and that we're using hopefully the more correct words. So I'm just going to cover a few of these. So a native species is a species that occurs naturally in a specified geographic area. And here in Florida, we tend to consider that as a species that was here prior to Europeans landing on landing in our state. So for us, this is going to be a species that's been here for at least a few hundred years to be considered native. A non-native species is one that does not occur naturally in a specified geographic area and has been introduced. So introduced means it was brought here intentionally or unintentionally by humans, and it was not here hundreds of years ago. And then the word established, when we use that, it refers to a species having a self-sustaining and reproducing population in a specified area without the need for human intervention. And so generally a species, in order to become invasive, not only is non-native and introduced, but it has to become established. It has to be self-sustaining and reproducing, and often it reproduces quite rapidly when it is considered invasive. Next. So an invasive species is one that is non-native, so it wasn't here hundreds of years ago. It somehow was introduced here by humans, and we're going to talk more about that. It can either be introduced intentionally, like someone thought it was, oh, such a pretty little plant, I'm going to bring it to Florida and put it in my yard, or it could have been introduced unintentionally. And then also to be invasive, it has to be a species that is going to cause environmental or economic harm or harm to humans. And then there's a couple other terms to cover. Nuisance species is an individual or group of species that causes management issues or property damage. It can present a threat to public safety, or it's just an annoyance. And this can apply to both native and non-native species. And so the example I always refer to for this one is vitis or grape species. And if you've been in Florida, you know that grapevine often covers a lot of other plants. It grows really rapidly, and it is a native species. So it has been here for hundreds of years. It is important to our ecosystem, but it also can become a nuisance by overgrowth. And then range change is when a species' current or existing range grows, shrinks, or shifts over time. And so this also can happen to both native, non-native, and invasive species. And so the ones I refer to as examples for this are coyotes and armadillos, which are not considered native to Florida, but they did have a natural range change. For instance, coyotes moved into Florida after the red wolf was extirpated from our state, and there was no longer that competition between coyotes and wolves, and coyotes were able to move into our state. And a similar thing happened with armadillos as well. So sometimes we just have this range change that occurs because of other reasons. And actually, we had a fascinating presentation from Master Naturalist graduates last night from one of the curators at the Florida Museum in Gainesville, who is a botanist, and talked about how they are starting to track this range change in invasive species due to climate change, for instance. And so that's just a whole nother fascinating area. Next. So definition of a naturalized plant or animal, a non-native plant that does not need human help to reproduce and maintain itself over time in an area where it is not native. So that's like what we just talked about with coyotes or armadillos, is they moved in, they weren't originally native, they were able to reproduce here, and they are both in all 67 counties of our state. Even though their offspring reproduce and spread naturally without human help, naturalized plants or animals do not over time become native members of our local plant or animal community. Next. Just a reminder, once again, we really like to drill in our definition of what makes a species invasive. It's not just that it's non-native. We can have Florida-friendly non-native plants that are not causing problems in our ecosystem. So it has to be a non-native species introduced by humans intentionally or unintentionally, but it also has to cause or potentially cause environmental or economic harm or harm to human health. Next. These are some of the other words that these are still being used by some agencies and individuals, and that's what we were trying to get away from, is having all these different words for the same thing. And also some of these words just aren't as sensitive or politically correct to be utilized. So we really want to gear ourselves towards using native, non-native, or invasive as our terminology. Next. And also just a reminder that not all non-native plants become invasive. A noxious weed, so this is actually a legal definition, is any plant or plant product that can directly or indirectly injure or cause damage to crops, livestock, poultry, or other interests of agriculture, irrigation, navigation. So Armando's going to talk about a few of those. The natural resources of the US, the public health, or the environment. So this is actually a definition in a law. And when things are defined or listed on the noxious weed list, there's a federal and a state noxious weed list. They are actually prohibited from use in that state. Next. So let's talk a little bit more about the problems and how these plants and animals, but today we're talking about plants, how they become invasive. And some of that is because they can spread really rapidly. They can grow quickly. They can have rapid reproductive cycles, meaning lots of generations or lots of seed production multiple times throughout the year, or they have a high fecundity. So they reproduce multiple times of the year, but they reproduce a lot. So they might have both of those things, or at least one of them, as strategies that allow them to become invasive. Generally, they also have behavioral plasticity. So I believe Armando will talk a little bit about that today too, especially in terms of salinity tolerance of some of these plants. And so behavioral plasticity refers to having a tolerance to a wide range of conditions. And so they may be able to outcompete native plants because of that. And then often the plants that become invasive lack their native predators or diseases that keep them in check in their native locations. Next. So some of the dangers of these invasive plants is that they are outcompeting our native species. They are sometimes crowding out, pushing out, over competing with our native plants. They may also push threatened species to extinction, and not just the plants that the native plants that they're competing with, but they may shift habitat, or they may not provide the food or other types of habitat needed for some of our animals or that are threatened. Some of our invasive plants actually are either fire tolerant or do really well with fire or burn really hot. So they may increase wildfire risk, or they may increase fire fuel. Some of our tall non-native plants can be unstable in tropical events. And I think Armando might be talking about Australian pine today. And then invasive plants are just very difficult and expensive to control. Next, so they are a strain on our resources. So the National Park Service is just one of the many agencies that works on this issue of invasive plants. And this is a great quote They are referring to invasive organisms as biological pollution. So they say some exotics are capable of hybridizing with native plant relatives, and we see that here in Florida with things like lantana, resulting in unnatural changes to a plant's genetic makeup. Still others contain toxins that may be lethal to certain animals. Exotic organisms have been referred to as biological pollution. In some cases, exotic plant invaders are driving our rarest species closer to extinction. Next. And another National Park Service quote, European settlers brought hundreds of plants to North America. Introductions continue today and are increasing due to an exploding human population. Many introduced plants have become naturalized across the continent, and some are replacing North American native plant species. Next. So some of the impacts. Go ahead. Another National Park Service quote, invasive non-native organisms are one of the greatest threats to the natural ecosystems of the US and are destroying America's natural history and identity. So that's some pretty strong language. That's how intense an issue this is, according to the National Park Service and many of our other agencies. These unwelcome plants, insects, and other organisms are disrupting the ecology of natural ecosystems, displacing native plant and animal species, and degrading our nation's unique and diverse biological resources. Next. So let's talk some of the costs. So in the fiscal year of 2010 to 2011, Florida spent approximately $23 million fighting invasive plants. So just in our state, and that was 10 years ago. So I can bet you that these numbers are even higher now. About 15 years ago, there was a study that indicated the annual cost to the United States economy is estimated at $120 billion a year. So that's a big figure too. The Nature Conservancy indicated that over 100 million acres, which is an area roughly the size of the state of California, is suffering from invasive plant infestations. And invasive species have contributed directly to the decline of 42% of threatened and endangered species in the United States. So that's a direct impact on threatened and endangered species. Next. And then we like to talk about the invasion curve because this is just such a great graphical depiction of this issue. So if you look at where the X and Y axis come together on the lower left of the screen, that's when a species has not even entered into a geographic area yet. And so we are then at that point in the stage of prevention. And that, of course, is the cheapest and best place to be, is sort of keeping an eye out for species that we are concerned could become invasive if they enter into a certain geographic area. And so many of us working in invasive species do something called early detection, rapid response. So we have a watch list of plants and animals that we're concerned might get into a certain geographic area. And if they were to, would potentially become invasive and cause problems. So the best thing to do is to try to catch them before they even get into the area. So that's where we want to be. The next stage is eradication. And this is when the invasive species has entered into an area, but there is a small number of localized populations and there's still hope for eradication. This is something like the giant African land snail that did get into Florida. It's a huge snail, obviously by its name. And it was a big concern that it was going to eat our agricultural crops, and we were able to eradicate it and get it out of Florida, which was great. But as we move further up, if we don't eradicate that species, then we're into containment or asset-based protection. And this is when the number of species and the geographic amount of range that it's covering expands. And it is much harder, much more expensive, much more strain on all sorts of resources, whether that be time, money, machinery, chemicals, whatever is needed to try to manage that species now. And once we're in asset-based protection, that's often where we're just trying to keep our natural areas, like a place like Myakka River State Park. We're just trying to keep that as natural as possible. And we might have to let go of some of the smaller parks because we just don't have the resources to manage every single natural area for that specific invasive species. Next. So who determines invasive status in Florida? So if we look at, legal, usually that is the USDA and the FWC. So these are some of our legal regulatory agencies that actually get the laws on the books and are in charge for regulating and managing invasive species, both plants and animals. When we look at where can you get advice and information, or agencies that are gathering information about what species are invasive, where they're occurring, and what you can do about them, then that's both the USDA as well as the USGS. Certainly University of Florida, we have a Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants, and we also have a IFAS assessment, which is one of the main tools for figuring out if a plant is either invasive in the northern, central, or southern regions of Florida, if it has a potential to be invasive and you shouldn't plant it, or if the researchers have determined that it is safe to use or plant here in the state of Florida. So regulatory agencies different from informational or educational agencies. Next. I think we're going to turn it over to Armando here. So Armando, take it away.
All right, that's great introduction to the topic. And as Catherine said, you might have heard this before, but it's also good a reinforcement to hear it again. So Catherine alluded to the fact that some of these invasive species were brought by the early Europeans that came into place. And yeah, that's the case for a lot of these species, but some of them actually are bringing up today, like we speak. And some of them early in the century as well, and the last century as well. So it's not just in the past, something that we're facing this problem in the recent past and obviously in the present. Some of the ways that invasive species, especially those affecting marine and coastal environments, may not as much plants in this way, but a lot of the other organisms, like living organisms like snails and fish and other things, they come in ballast waters, which is the water that these big cargo ships have to put in inside there to stabilize the boat. So basically when they have a lot of cargo, they're very heavy, but when they dump all or they bring back, they don't have anything on board, they have to balance. So they put this massive amount of water that they might be getting, from the Mediterranean Sea, and then bring all the water, which there's regulations needs to be treated, but anyway, there's CAPI, and in the recent past, we didn't know much about it. So a lot of larvae, small organisms, and they became big, or etc. That's a way to introduce them. Natural disasters, obviously, that's another way that invasive species can be introduced, especially exotic species. If you have pets that they don't belong here and then they escape, we have some examples of those. So that's another way that invasive species can actually escape their location. Intentional releases, and this goes with plants and animals as well. We have a lot of people that have pets and then they feel bad about them, about they can't handle anymore, they're too big, and they don't want to kill us, so they release it into the wild, which can become a problem as well. Sometimes we do carry invasive species by mistake. We'll see some of these strategies used by some of these plants that they attach to the body or attach to clothes. Some seeds can be in the mud of shoes. That's why I don't know if you've been in the airport and they ask if you've been in a farm. Well, they are looking for potential invasive species in the mud of your shoes and other things. So that's another way invasive species can get into a new location. And obviously, as I said, in the case of pets, it's released, but some is intentional implanting, especially ornamentals. We'll see some examples through the presentation that a lot of these plants that we're dealing with, they were introduced as ornamentals and people plant them everywhere. So that was the problem, and now we're facing the consequences of those. All right, so here in Florida, there is a problem, right, for invasive species. We have a lot of ports. So I think it's a state with a high number of ports. So we have a lot of ships coming back and forward, bringing all kind of stuff. and it's hard to be on top of those. It talks about that 25,000 plants approximately introduced every year, some on purpose, some without, not on purpose. So it's a big problem. Acquiring traits, especially for aquatic plants, can be a big issue as well. There's a lot of organisms that are being traded and sell, and there's not a lot of information about them. And then once we find out, they become invasive. Well, like Catherine was saying, it's a little bit too late, right? I already talked about ballast waters of ships transported by boats. We have a lot of special organisms that can attach to the bottom of boats. That's a big problem in the Great Lakes. We have a lot of snails that there were a lot of bivalves that were moved that way as well. And then souvenirs, right? You bring something you think is cool to keep, and then it doesn't belong there. So there's many different ways to bring invasive species into an area. Like we were saying before, it's a big problem after coastal, development. It might be the second biggest threat for natural environment with these invasive species. Some of the things that favor, Catherine talked about climate change, invasive species being able to move by the areas that they were not able because of the climate, well, the weather patterns in that area, but the climate change is changing. So some of these invasive might be able to reach out. An example of that might be the python, right? The python is a reptile, huge snake that's found its way in the Everglades. Well, they think that maybe the cold of the north parts of the state might keep it outside that area and prevent it from expanding other areas. But if the climate, temperatures becoming warmer, and then those species might be able to colonize those areas. Like I said, we have a lot of trades. We are nurseries, etc., trading with many different parts of the world. So there's a chance that we might bring more invasive species. Some of the immediate consequences of invasive species, or some of the things that might affect is extinction of some animals. In fact, there's a lot of research made, and we can share that with you, in looking into how many taxes, how many species have been disappearing because invasive species is a high number. Also reduced biodiversity, so not only contribute to the extinction of some species, which extinction means that they are no longer on this planet. So there's some species that have disappeared completely because of invasive species. And also reducing biodiversity. So they might not be extinct, but it's reducing the number of the biomass of those native species in comparison to the invasive species. Doing that also is a competition between the natives and the invasives. Catherine already explained why some of these invasive species, they do very well and out compete some of the natives. And I'll give examples of that later as well. And for the matters, they also alter habitat. So, right, or ecosystem don't look the same because now they have all these different species that won't belong there. So there's a disbalance or alteration of the habitat. This is just to give you some examples of some research that's been done, looking at data from many different places, and look how the interaction can affect many different species. In this case, I alluded to two different papers. One is to look at a fresh turtle species, but the one I'm more interested in because of this presentation is the wetlands and invasive plants, how they have actually competed and affected this natural ecosystem. In this picture here, we have the Brazilian pepper. I'm going to be talking about that one quite a bit. So that's a big problem as well. And by the way, if you attended some of the previous plant invasive species talks, there's a lot of overlapping of these invasive species. Catherine talked about some of them having the plasticity to be in areas that they tolerate many different parameters, and one of them is salinity. So you will see some of these plants that maybe they were covered during the invasive plant species. You will see them in the coastal plant invasive species because they're actually in both places. So if you see some repetition, that's because that's the reason. So with that, I'm going to start talking about invasive plant species in our coast. There's many. Obviously, we won't be able to cover them all, but I'm going to give you examples of some of the ones that myself and some of the agents and all the faculty at UF have recognized as being a big problem in our state at the current moment. When we talk about the coast, so we are in a coastal county. I saw in the chat box that there's people from all over the place. Seminoles, so that's more inland. Well, we're all connected. In fact, we are peninsula, so talking about coastal versus non-coastal counties is hard. But we have a lot of shoreline. So when you think about the coastline or the coast, don't you just think about the barrier islands or the sand dunes like the one behind me. you have to think about the mangrove fringes. You have to think about all these wetlands that might not be right at the beach, but they are connected by streams, creeks, and things like that. So we are a whole coastal county. So if we have invasive species way in the east of Mayaca, that's still, to me, that's still, part of our coastal ecosystem because it's highly connected. So when I say coast, just don't think about, sand dunes or the beach. Think about the whole spectrum. So in this case, we have, natural parks, areas, like these mangrove fringes here. I think these little tunnels. We have Turtle Beach. I'm going to be talking about some of these plants affecting some of our local parks. We have invasive species also in very anthropogenic ecosystems. So well, not ecosystem, but areas that have been heavily impacted by humans activities like the scale golf courses and sand dunes. So again, it's a mix of different environments and different ecosystems which make our coastline, or I should say our coastal county. The first one I'm going to start with is the air potato vine. Unfortunately, I cannot see your faces. I cannot ask how many of you have seen this plant, but I'm guessing a lot of you have. You might even have it in your backyard. This is a vine, it grows really rapidly. This is from tropical Asia. So it was introduced actually not too long ago. I think about 1905, this plant was introduced into our state. It grows very fast, about 8 inches per day. It has this very easy to identify. So you see here the leaves, right? It's like a heart-shaped leaf. They grow in different sizes, especially when the plant is, far higher above. Normally, they have to have a tendency to have broader leaves, but it's very easy to recognize. It has this, kind of look like a potato, but it's actually called bulbils. Maybe I mispronounced that. It's right here. So these are aerial tubers, and that's how the plant actually, they grow on the stem. These things fall down into the ground, and that's how they grow a new plant. So it's a huge problem. You might see the potato vine might be disappearing in the winter months when it gets really cold. The leaves might just die, but the plant is still alive. So especially because it's just bulbils, they can grow new plants, and they can be on the ground for months until conditions are ideal for them to grow back and invade species. So they actually cover high canopies of trees. They go really, really high at all into the plant, and they can basically kill and suffocate some of these plants competed with native, and also the ground cover. Right now we don't have the ground cover. It's being shaded, so you don't have a lot of plants underneath the canopy of all these native trees. So you're losing not just this, you're affecting not only those trees where this vine is growing, but also some of the plants associated with those trees. They can be, some grasses and things like that, or some bushes. So it's a big problem, not just for the canopy, but also on the, I guess, lower levels in that area. There have been some biological controls techniques being used. One of them is the air potato beetle. It's led by UF, where you can get some beetles like this one and basically eat the plant or a lot of it, and then they just die. So they run out of food, and then they won't become a problem. And that's a way to actually control this plant. We might not be able to eradicate this plant completely, but we should be able to control it, at least in some areas that are sensitive. Natural areas or places that we have a lot of endemics, you want to keep them in shape. So this is a good plant that you guys can get organized and do some work and remove some of these big potatoes. One of the best way to do is put in a plastic bag and tie it, and then put it in the garbage can, because if you actually toss them out, you might be spreading them more. And if you don't put in a plastic bag, let's say that it doesn't go directly to the landfill, then you might be bringing this plant to some other places. So this is one of them. And again, it's through all the states. It's a huge problem. Mechanically, you can remove it, you can treat it with chemicals, but so far, one of the best things is the air potato beetles. Right, the next one is the alligator wheat. This one, I believe, was covered by my colleague, Dr. Abby Turner. But this is a plant that actually affects not just the inside of our country, but also the coastline, and affects a lot of creeks, a lot of rivers, a lot of estuaries that are connected to the Gulf or the Atlantic Ocean. So it affects flows of nutrient flow, water, migration of fishes, or other animals like manatees trying to navigate from the coastline in the summer months, during the winter months, finding out warmer waters in the springs. So it can become a huge problem. And It also increases mosquito habitat because it created this big mass. So it's kind of like creating this non-moving water pools in this area. So it can affect mosquitoes. It deplete oxygen from the water, which can affect fish communities. And yeah, so it's a huge problem. This one's actually from South America. It was introduced. This is a good example of the ballast water I was talking about, that those cargo ships, release on the water. That's how they think it got here. And this is in 1894. So a little older than the previous one, but it's not that old in time. I mean, obviously, yeah, it's more than 100 years. But if you think about it, it's relatively in the present, right? It's easy to recognize if you look at, I'm going to move my video here. So I don't know if you see those boxes, but if you look at this drawing here, right here, the flowers are very pretty little flowers, changes in coloration, more like a little white lavender kind of color. And it has these leaves opposite to each other. It has tiny little hairs that you cannot see here, but it's specified here. So it's not difficult to recognize when it's can be, just have to be submerged, as you can see in this picture. And some people might get confused because if you see it on the water versus outside the water, it might look a little bit different. But that's the interesting part about this species, right? They can be tolerate being totally submerged or not submerged. So very sturdy. If you go to the UF aquatic and plant species, invasive species, you can see more of maps, of distribution maps. So it's basically almost in every county in our state. We probably won't be able to control it, to eradicate it, but we might need to control it. It's a huge problem too, because these ones, even though they produce seeds and all kind of stuff, they actually reproduce by fragment. It's the best way for them to actually expand the range. So if mechanically you've been removing this plant and then you got a little piece of it in the water and then it gets carried by current somewhere else, you're actually helping the spread. So it's a huge problem. All right, that's enough with alligator wheat. Let's see which one we have next. Okay, beach vitex. This is one that is being seen more in the north part of the state. We need to keep an eye on this one because it's highly invasive, going across all our area, so it's very sturdy. So the native example of a plant that might be this cool and be able to sustain, high sulfur, heat, wind, sand. That might be, I just forget it. Yeah. Railroad vine, sorry, I'm trying to think. Railroad vine is a native plant that you see in coastal communities. Well, this one is out of competing some of those. So it creates a huge problem. It also can affect sea turtle nesting. Obviously, if you colonize these sand dunes, these areas. So it's a very sturdy plant. And one of the problems that with this plant, it says it right here, is allelopathic. That means it produces chemical that doesn't allow other plants to grow. So not just out of compete them through space, but also produces this chemical that doesn't allow other plants to grow. So then basically it's claiming the whole territory for themselves. So it's a huge problem. Mechanical removal is one of the things that's been done as well, but you can chemically treat it. Some of the issues with this chemical treatment is that sometimes you kill everything, and sometimes depending on the chemical, things won't grow for months. So you really have to assess each case and what is the best thing to do. That's one of the good ones, to do some volunteer work and identify in an area you might be able to get a bunch of people and then just go get it out. But yeah, it's a huge problem. You can see the flower here is very pretty looking plant, but again, it's not native. It's coming from Asia. We should not have it here. Beach vitex. Brazilian pepper. That one, I think everybody's seen it. I hope it's not easy to find. It's basically everywhere. This is another example of an ornamental. This is a little older when it was introduced. It's 1840s. This is from South America. You have it in Paraguay, Brazil, I think some parts of Argentina as well. But also anyway, this is a South American tree. It was introduced here because it has these beautiful berries. So it's also known as a Christmas tree. And you see it just because it's red fruit. It is in the same family than poison ivy and poison oak. That's why some people can be irritated with latex they produce. So if you mechanically remove it or by hand, you have to be careful And one of the problems with this plant is that it encroaches other plants. So it grows really heavily. It doesn't have a huge trunk. Normally it's kind of hidden, but it has all these different branches with all these different leaves. It creates a huge trunk more at the base, and it's kind of thin. So it's not this hard tree with this huge tree, but it has many different branches. It can grow really tall. It can out-compete really fast and really easy some of the natives. And we talk about plasticity, that's being able to cope with different parameters. And this is one plant that can actually do that, because it can actually tolerate very high salinity, so actually compete with some of the most beautiful native plants that we have here, which are the three native mangrove trees, which I love mangroves. That's why I'm emphasizing how beautiful and important are to us. But Brazilian pepper is creating a huge trouble, not just inland, but around waterways and with the mangroves. A little bit of controversy here. Some beekeepers love Brazilian pepper because it flowers year round, so bees, have source of food, and then they can produce more honey. But it doesn't belong here, and it costs thousands of dollars to trying to remove it. So it's a huge problem. They calculated about 7,000 acres of land in Florida are invaded by Brazilian pepper. So it's a huge problem. Very easy to recognize. Again, if one of the ways, and if you're sensitive to poison ivy, you might not want to do that. But if you cut the leaf in half and you smell it, it kind of smells like pepperish lime smell. So that's why the pepper, but it's also kind of lime. At least that's how I described it. But it's not edible or anything like that. Way to be distributed is a lot of animals eat those berries, so from mammals to birds. But you still see people planting them. And by the way, this is illegal to possess. It's legal to plant. And if you have it, you should remove it. And if you need more information about that, obviously with Extension, we have resources, there's links, but just call your Extension office and they'll help you. You can chemically treat it. Have to be careful where you are, especially if you're by the waterways. You might not want to, you have to have a license and you have to follow the labels, all those things. So yeah, again, it can be complicated and it's costly. So if you identify your property, you want to get rid of it when it's very tiny and very little, and keep an eye on it, that same spot, because it might grow again. All right. The next one is a Chinese tallow. This is not from Florida. Again, this is another invasive species. As you can see here, it's from Asia. It's also easy to recognize, kind of have the heart-shaped kind of leaf, not as pronounced as the herb potato vine, but it kind of looks the same, although this is a tree, not a vine. You can see the fruit here. This is the dark kind of weird triangle shape, dark coloration when it becomes mature. It was here brought in for oil. They wanted to extract oil from the seeds, but yeah, it can invade a bunch of different habitats and it's scary about birds. So it's a huge problem and it's illegal to have now. Mature trees can be and should be cut down and treated, chemically treated, otherwise it will come back. And that's one of the problems that we have with this one, that a lot of people just cut them, chop it down, but it's very easy for this plant to come back. You see it inland and you also see it along shorelines and competing with our native plants, including some of the mangrove associated species. This is another one that you might have seen, or you might have seen and not recognize it. This is a problem as well. This is a grass, which is highly invasive. You can see in the picture, it has different kind of coloration. So that's why I was saying that you might have seen it and not know that it is cone grass. It not only affects inland, but also affect obviously waterways. You see that we were talking with Catherine that is here at some of the barrier islands, and it can grow so fast and so thick that really out-compete all the other grasses. So it's a huge problem. And it's not just here, but it's also in other parts of the globe. So it's heavily introduced in many different countries. And now it's overtaking everything. Cattle doesn't really like it because it has this serrated blades, so it's not has a pylon, I guess, to eat for them. So it's not as good. The leaves might appear very light in color or very kind of dark coloration right here with the red. The flowers have these little tiny seeds, which produce many different, I forgot how many, but it's thousands of seeds. However, it seems like here it's not being distributed by the wind, by the seeds. Exactly, it is a rhizomatous plant. That means that they have this rhizome system, which kind of like a root system. So they basically on the ground, or sometimes you see this rhizomatous structure above the ground, but they basically it's like a little tube and then grow another plant and then expanding, right? So it colonize these huge areas and it's very hard to remove and treat it. And because of that strategy, sometimes even if it gets born or treated, it's still on the ground, then they can, resurface. So it's a huge problem and it's very sturdy. So if you do have it, try to control it because you don't want it to go crazy in your property or anywhere really. This aquatic plant, the water milfoil, this is a European plant. Sorry, yeah, Eurasia and Northern Africa. So that kind of region, the old world. This is introduced by the aquatic trade, is ornamental. Again, like the alligator wheat, it can be submerged and it might not, and it doesn't need to be submerged. So it can look very differently than when it's totally on the water, than it's not on the water. It's very easy to recognize though, because you have these branches. See, that's opposite branches and not branch, but leaves. And then right here, look like kind of like a Christmas tree, miniature Christmas tree, each section. Here, this cartoon allows you to look better. This is looking at it from above. So this kind of look like if it is erect, obviously if you're looking at the water, and this is how it look through the whole stem. It creates a lot of problems, just like alligator wheat creates huge mats, so it prevents sunlight from reaching the bottom. So you might have some algae that may be impacted. You might have some seagrasses being impacted. It can impact birds and fish. Again, it changes the structure of the system. So now if you had all these fish that come in, like the mosquito fish that come to go and feed on the surface, now it's all this mat layer on top of it. So it can affect that. It can affect birds because now they cannot feed on those prey. So if you have a shorebird trying to eat those fish or snails or whatever is eating down there, now it can't see it. So it's a huge problem, right? In the auto compete, not just the plants, but it creates all this unbalance in our system. It can be chemically treated. Again, if we break down a little piece, they can go somewhere else. So it's a huge problem. Navigation, a lot of these aquatic plants that I'm showing you, one of the main problems, at least in terms of the economy and recreation, affects some of the stuff that we do, like boating. A lot of areas are being totally closed up by these plants, and then boats cannot go around it. The propels get, it gets entangled, the propels, so nobody wants to do that. So it obviously reduces fishing grounds, it reduces some economic activities like ecotourism. So they're huge problems as well. So that was the water milfoil. Another aquatic plant that it can be fresh and but create problems affect some of the connectivity along the systems is this giant salvinia. This is very easy to recognize plant because of the leaves is kind of like spongy looking, kind of like, and it has this shape, kind of like the railroad vine in a way that kind of like closes in. But you see it right here. Just think about kind of like a moped mouth. I don't know. But it created this huge mats, and it is very, if you look at this picture right here, I'm moving the video, so I hope you're not seeing that black box. If you see here the root system of it, obviously it's aquatic plant, so it's in the water floating there. It's not very, it doesn't go down as much as other plants, so it's above, but it's very thick, and that way also very easy for it to move with water currents. So it's a body of water, it has tidal flow. That's very easy way for it to expand the range. But even though it doesn't create this huge system of roots that go down, it has very dense system of root top, so it creates the same problems with fish I was telling you about. It prevents oxygen. It takes a lot of this CO2. It does produce oxygen, but it's blocking the pass and the exchange of gases between the surface and the bottom. So it's decreasing the exchange of gas at the surface level, so it's decreasing level. And also it might be impacting some of these algae or plants that they were growing native plants that they were growing, native algae were growing in that system that actually producing oxygen. So now these plants that also depend on sunlight cannot get the sunlight, so they're dying off, which contribute to also the depletion of oxygen, which do affect wildlife. So again, big impacts into our systems and environment, economy, et cetera, et cetera. That was the giant salvinia. Now we're gonna go with another aquatic species. You probably, and I'm sure that Dr. Abiterma talked about this one as well. This is the Hydraulia. It's a huge problem as well. It's introduced here not so long ago, actually. This is introduced in the 1950s. So some of you might have been around when that happened. I wasn't, I was a little bit later than that. But anyway, it's very recently and mainly introduced in the south and then expanded. It grows in the surface, spread vertically, very rapidly. It's again one of those that you can see it submerged, but you might not see it submerged. It might look differently. It clogs canals, irrigation systems, as you can read there. So it's a huge problem, right? One way to remove it is mechanically, but again, just like the alligator wheat, this one cut a piece, and then it will basically just grow in another place, and it will be okay. So sometimes when you mechanically removing these plants, you're actually helping expand even more. Yeah, it's basically everywhere now. Millions and millions of dollars are being expended, especially in areas that there's a little boat traffic, parks, waterways. So all these different bodies of waters, people managing these bodies of water, they have to do something for it. So they have to spend not, obviously labor, but money into try to control it. You can see here a picture of a boat that went into that mat of the Hydraulia. Not fun, I'm sure, collecting, getting that stuff how you propel, but also by, again, cutting all these little pieces, you might be bringing this plant with you somewhere else. So huge, huge, huge problem. Says some small infestation of Hydraulia can be removed manually, but if it grows to a level that it's not possible, then you might be in big trouble. So learn it, identify quickly, and remove it. This is not an aquatic plant, but it is very close to a coastline. You see it, this is an ornamental, so it was introduced here not too long ago either. This is from East Africa to India, Southwest Asia, Pacific Islands. I don't know exactly when it was introduced, but I know it's not too long ago. I was trying to find the specific dates, but it can go year round. It produces little flowers called the naupaka. There's a native naupaka. The way to recognize this one is the fruit is a different color, and it's called also the half flower, because you can see here, it's kind of like a half flower, so it's missing the other part. So it's very easy to recognize. It's used a lot in coastal properties through the landscaper community. They use this plant quite a bit to create like divide properties, I guess, right? But they're not as good as, and then some people plant it supposedly to prevent erosion, but they're not as good at doing that. They grow really thick, they grow really fast, they displace native plants, including beach plants, sea lavender. So it's displacing some of the endemic. And by endemic, if you don't know what endemic is, it's a species that only lives a certain part of and that's it. Like our blue jay, the scrub jays, those are endemic birds, I believe. So they're only found here. I said, yeah, right. We'll rectify that. But there's this only found there. So if you have a plant that is actually destroying or out-competed, destroying the habitat and out-competed some of this endemic, it's a huge problem because the endemic will disappear, so it will go extinct. So that's another example how invasive species can make all the species become extinct. This picture, I took this picture at a Tallow beach. So for those near in Sarasota County or in Sarasota County, if you go to Tallow beach, you will see these two pictures are from there. So this is another invasive species. I'm going to talk about it, but it's basically growing everywhere, and it's growing next to the mangroves and next to this Brazilian peppers right there, which you have a bunch of invasives in one single spot. Next one, there's a grass. This one is a very problematic grass, torpedo grass. You might have seen it. and don't even recognize it. Grasses are hard, I understand that. But if you look how it grows, it's kind of that rhizomatous example. And it basically just expand and keeps going horizontally and then vertically and horizontally and vertically. It grows very well in many different sites, and it's very high plasticity when it comes to salinity. Like you can see here, 20 part per thousands. By the way, that's a huge salinity for a lot of these plants that can tolerate salt. Most plants don't deal well with salt. Some plants have adapted to be able to do that, like mangroves, but some of these invasive species, which maybe they won't be the ideal place to grow, but they can grow in those places. So it's huge. You can see here some estimates about $2 million annually for full control. So it's a huge problem, right? They create this huge math. You can see here in the picture to my right, was to my right to me. It looks like a boat went through it. This probably gets, submerged during some time of the year. This plant can deal with that as well. But see, all of this is torpedo grass. So it's a huge, huge problem in our state, and it's costing us thousands and thousands of dollars. It's taking over about 70% of public waters. That's what it says here for it. So it's pretty much everywhere. It can invade also disturbed areas. That's another problem with this invasive species. And I'll talk to you about cedar wheat, I believe. But a lot of they're very opportunistic. So when we anthropogenically, we alter some habitat and we change it, then some of these plants are very opportunistic to colonize those areas faster than some of the native species. So once they colonize and they establish, even the natives might take advantage of that opportunity. They can't anymore. There's examples I'm going to give it later, but some invasive animals can actually facilitate not just by dispersing some of the seeds, but also by opening habitats for some of these invasive species of plants to colonize these areas. It can be treated chemically again, but you might be affecting the ecosystem there just because you might be killing all things. So you need more information. You're dealing with torpedo grass, just reach out to your extension office nearby, and there's tons of information about torpedo grass, unfortunately and fortunately. You know what I mean? The water hyacinth, that's another one that it was introduced here, an ornamental. This is a little older in the picture here. This is 1884, around there. So again, not too long ago, if you think about it, this is from South America. It's a beautiful aquatic plant, very beautiful, shiny leaves, beautiful arrange of flowers, but it's not native and it's causing huge troubles in our state. And not just in our state, but all parts of the globe as well. This is one of those that has been introduced in many, many different parts of the world, but it is statewide. You might have seen it, just like the other examples, right? Thick layer of vegetation on top. It disrupts the system, feeding of animals from the surface into the water, animals feeding from the surface, different migrations of animals, manatees, even though manatees can eat this plant, I know it's not their favorite, and it can make it hard for some animals to move around. So it's a huge trouble. Mechanically can be removed, but again, it's a lot of hard work to try to do it. You can do some chemical treatment for temporary reliefs, but it's not as effective. And now something to point out is that since you're talking about reproduction, some of these plants, a lot of plants have more than one mechanism to distribute, right, to expand the range. So sometimes you see that in invasive species, they utilize the one that obviously works best for that area. So they might not be needing all, they might not have those predators eating them. So if they were dispersed by seeds, it might not be that the case anymore because nobody's eating the fruit. So they capitalize into all these different adaptations that they have and using the ones more suitable for the environment where they're in. And again, this is being opportunistic and a high rate of colonization and establish it and being able to establish compared to some of these native species, which they're competing with other natives. And that's what things keep in shape, right? You have all these different natives that for thousands of years have evolved together, trying to one be ahead of the other one. But then sometimes they kind of, there's obviously some that dominance, and that's how you sometimes classify system because they're more dominant species. But then this invasive species, they don't have really anybody to compete with, and they have great adaptations. So big problem. This is another one that it was introduced. Is you can see it in freshwater systems along canals, creeks, and also more like coastline kind of environments. It's a problem as well as the other ones. This is from India, in Asia, Southeast Asia. It's a beautiful plant. Why create trouble? Even if you might not see it just right on the coastline, but in creeks, I was gonna give you another example. Snook uses tidal creeks, the little ones, to survive maybe the first 2 years of their life. They're in these very freshwater systems, but they need some kind of currents and needs, certain characteristic for it to be able, before they have to go move into deeper waters, go to the estuary, eventually reproduce and offshore and come back. So a lot of these fish have this adaptation that the little ones can tolerate low salinities, but the big ones cannot tolerate low salinities, and that's how prevent the little ones being eaten by maybe even their own species. But now you put in all these different plants, it's changing that habitat. Now you decreasing this ideal habitat for this little fish that we care for. And snook, if you're not a fisher, then you might not know this, but this is it's a popular fish that a lot of people come here to fish, and obviously it has a huge economic impact. So if you plant in or you let in this invasive species, disrupt this might seem not as useful, different habitats, you might have a huge impact into an area and a whole ecosystem. So 1 plant, 2 plants, 3 plants, many plants can count and create a big problem. This is the wild taro. Again, this is it has a huge leaves. Sometimes it's confused with the elephant ear. They're very similar, but the elephant ear, the attachment of this part of the plant to the leaf is different. And you can go to the site and then they'll have the examples, so no need for me to go into details. It's huge, this kind of like a root system, kind of like potato. It's not potato, but it can be eaten. I think it's an edible plant. And again, you can chop it, but if you don't actually get it out, it can regrow, and it's a huge problem. It's a beautiful plant, but again, it's not native of Florida, and it's creating problems. All right, let me see if there's questions. All right, thank you for pulling those links over there. This is one that drives me crazy because I hike a lot and I see it everywhere. Well, I see the other ones too, but this one, especially, I'm gonna tell you what I have problem with this one. Wild hogs. People call them wild hogs. I guess it's a proper term, but this is not wild. It's a feral pig. It was brought by Europeans, so it's an invasive species. Love and hate by many. Love by hunters in some areas. Yeah, I guess it's fun, but we also have managed them in natural areas. Catherine can tell you more. She used to live in Oscar Shore State Park. So it's a huge problem. Very hard to control and manage. They eat a bunch of many different things. This is normal behavior. They basically are like bulldozers. So they eat a bunch of fruits, reptiles, insects, fungi, I should say mushrooms, maybe fungi too. I don't know, the mycelium. They're really disruptive into the land. And that was the example I was giving you before, that some of these species can opportunistically take advantage of that disruption. So Caesar wheat is one of those that it's not from here, it's from Asia. It's grown here as an ornamental. It's related to hibiscus. You see beautiful flower right here. It's basically everywhere, established now in the state. But when you see clearing of soil, and especially in natural park, in public lands, when they have pigs, many pigs creating this problem, Caesar wheat is one that you see coming back very soon. So what I get mad about this one, because I already don't like pigs altering our natural habitats, but then I see what the pigs are helping the Caesar wheat, so it's a double trouble, and that makes me unhappy. This plant has a tendency to, well, not have a tendency, adaptation, that this is not the seed, this is actually the fruit. So it attaches to your clothes, and that's what's carried away. It also can attach to the fur of animals. So this pig is not only now opening this land for this Caesar wheat, but it's also bringing this fruit attached to the body and dropping some pollen cells. But we do that too. I have a lab. I take my lab hiking, but every time we get out of the trail, before we get out of the trail, I check myself and I check my dog for the fruit. And the best way to get rid of them, obviously, if you throw them right there, you disperse them. I put it in a plastic bag. Since I have my dog, I have a poop bag, not a used one, obviously. I clean one and I put the seed there, and then I make a kind of like the air potato bag, and then I put it in the garbage can. That way, most likely it won't survive. All right, that's a very good question. We'll talk more about that one later. I just saw the chat box. Somebody talk about nurseries. Again, you can find more information about scissor weed. In fact, I made a video about scissor weed. You don't have to look at it, but if you want to, you can. This is another problematic invasive species. Let me see how we're doing here. We're time. We're good. This is the snake plant. Some people know it has the mother-in-law tongue plant, so it has all the different common names. Obviously, common names can vary, and that's another problem why some people think they have a native because it's called the same. But this one is not that case. This is a snake plant or mother-in-law tongue. This is from Africa. It has a highly invasion risk. Oh, this shouldn't be like this. Sorry for that table kind of being crooked. If you're local here, I think there's like 2 or 3 species, but in particular, this species, the Trifasciata, if you go to Spanish Point, the museum, botanical garden / museum, all these shell mittens which is prehistoric, right? They are from the indigenous people that lived here before the conquistadores came here. Shell mittens, so it's this hills of shells being deposited by early humans living here. And that area got colonized, obviously, by other people, and then they brought these plants, I think, because Bertha Palmer actually had it in their garden, but that land was unattended for many different years, and this plant basically created this root system. So on the ground, this rhizome system that is very hard to remove. So once you put it in an area, if it's not in a pot that is not touching soil, that plant will basically grow up maybe even, meters or very, very far away from the original source where it was. Normally, it won't just grow far away, probably will expand. But what I'm saying is that if you think that you have a control here, but you haven't really controlled the expansion on the ground, then you have this problem. That's what happened there. So they have this shell mitten now. It's basically colonized by this plant. And because it's a historical site, they want to preserve the mitten, but they cannot do a heavily removal because it doesn't contain the soil very well. So it's creating erosion problems. So they have a huge problem. So they deal with it little by little, but they won't be able to eradicate it. And again, it's an ornamental. It's very common to see. You see a lot I drive around my county and I see it in people's yards, and I'm just thinking, oh, it's gonna show up in their yard, and yeah, that's the way it goes. So if you have a snake plant, keep it inside, keep it in a pot. They're very common among the ornamentals, but it should not be put on the ground somewhere else. This is another picture that I took from Turtle Beach. This is, you can see here, we have the half flower. Well, maybe it's on the left, so you don't see it here. But these are mangroves. Right here, you have a black mangrove. I think it's a bottomwood right here, which is not a true mangrove. In Puerto Rico, by the way, they do call it a mangrove. Here we don't. But it's an important species associated with mangrove ecosystems. So you can see here that plant is basically growing everywhere. And I believe the source of this plant, I'm not going to blame if you are familiar with Turtle Beach, at the end, there's a condominium area, and they do have this plant in their landscape. So I'm sure it came from there, but yeah, who knows? Huge problem and shouldn't be there. That's the last one. I mean, we can talk more about many different plants, but you can see there are many. I do want to talk about this one because it's a huge problem. Catherine was referring how can create problems when we have natural disasters. This plant was brought in fact, has to help with wind resistance and erosion, and it does the opposite. It collapsed really easily when high winds, you can see here, and it have very shallow root system. So basically it took the whole upper layer of that area right there. There's even a boat there. But anyway, it breaks easily. It's not true pine. Not only very shallow root system, very easy to collapse and during high winds, because they have very shallow root system. If they're nearby water bodies, then it doesn't help with erosion. In fact, it enhances erosion. And then when you have these events, that's when these trees collapse. So it can be very dangerous. Again, if you're local, I don't know if you remember, but after you cross the bridge from Lido, from Sarasota to Lido Key, that area stretch, it has many Australian pines. Some of them collapsed, and I think it was Irma, I forgot what hurricane recently, and good thing that they actually took them out, most of them, and they put mangroves. They are controversial some areas because they were so common and they were brought here and they put in a lot of public land. So that's the only shade that is there. But we little by little should be removing these ones and putting some of the oaks that we had before, maybe some of the palms that we have native, like couch palm, even mangroves, bottomwood. And Australian pine is here to stay. Unfortunately, we have islands, we have shorelines and shorelines. Alligator through the Everglades is full of Australian pines. But we should be doing a better job, or at least I know a lot of people are trying, but you all can help. And please don't ever plant an Australian pine. That's a big problem. I was gonna say something. Oh yeah, and the leaves are actually this, again, they're not pine. So the leaves are these structures right here. They're like this kind of tubular. It creates so dense mat on the ground when they drop that nothing grows in it. It's just like having mulch, right? It's putting all this mulch. Kind of, that's the way the analogy for me. So it's basically not allowing anything else to grow there. And again, very shallow root systems, so they can create a lot of problems. This is the picture of the water hyacinth. As you can tell, this is as far as you can see, which is incredible. So think about this. This plant wasn't here before, and now it's here. I wonder how the system looked like 60 years ago. I wish I'd seen it. I've seen areas that now they're totally colonized, not as much in the state, but in other parts of the globe. And yeah, it is very dramatic. If you've never seen this before, you might see this as a natural setting, but now you all know that this is not, and this should not be happening. All right. So where to find information? There's many different sources. Catherine has a slide at the beginning where you meant USGS, FWC, more the regulatory agency. But for us, the best place that we send people is the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants. They have a directory, so you can just type the name if you know it by name. If not, they have a whole list alphabetically. So there's many different ways to navigate. And each species will have, some of them have more information than others. Obviously, some more research has been done in other ones, but they will have a way to how you manage it, how you can treat it chemically, or if that's the best way, what you need to take care of, identification. So you have a lot of resources to learn your invasive species. If you don't know many of them, I will start with this one from this presentation. Again, these ones we have identified as highly problematic. That doesn't mean that they are the most problematic, but they are some of the most problematic ones. So start with those and then expand your knowledge. You can see a picture here. This is submerged. So it's a lot different than if it wasn't, but it's another aquatic that's really that we're looking at. USGS, again, has a lot of resources. This is, a federal agency. It has not just plants, it has amphibians, as you can see there, fish, marine fishes, etc. I use this quite extensively. It provides a lot of historical information too about distribution and expansion. Some of them have animated maps of how these plants or animals or different organisms have distributed, expanded the range and established. So it's kind of fascinating. One of them, if you were in my fish talk, I show you how the lionfish. That's totally fascinating to me, how to see that representation. So USGS is a site that I highly recommend as well. This is another example. I know this is talking about non-indigenous aquatic species, but I just want to give you an example how you can also look by state. So this is USGS. They do have that for all the organisms. So you can look at a particular area, particular state, zoom in, zoom out, do all kind of queries and look at different things. So again, this is a great site, free to use. If you are into GIS, you can also download some of this data and play with it that's what you're into. All right, and I think, Catherine, you're going to be talking about management of invasive species, and we're going to go back and forth with some of the slides, but I'm going to pass it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Armando. So much great information. If you can go to the next slide. So I'm just going to say some very basic words about managing invasive organisms in natural areas, whether, right now we're mostly focused on coastal plants, for instance, but this is sort of an overview in terms of all different types of invasive species and different areas. And really, we recommend what we call an integrative pest management response, so IPM, and looking first at what we talked about earlier, which is early detection, rapid response. So prevention is always cheaper and more effective than having to deal with the species once it is here and established and potentially taking over large geographic areas. So, getting that information, knowing what species to look out for. I'm going to talk in a few minutes about organizations called SISMAs, or they're actually regional groups here in the state of Florida and in other states as well. So often your regional SISMA will have an EDRR list of things to be looking out for, or if you just notice, especially if it's a lizard, because that's a huge issue. We have a big issue with invasive lizards, or some type of plant that you have never seen before and you're really concerned about. That could be something to look up or to contact us about so that we can help you determine whether or not it's something we need to be concerned about here in this county or in others. So that's one of the first things we want to do. Our next thing we want to think about in terms of management is education. So that's why we're here doing this series, is just educating your friends, your family, your neighbors, your HOA about how big an issue invasive species really is, how that really is impacting our environment, our ecosystems, but also impacting our economy, as some of these invasive species impact our crops and our agriculture. So it's not just that we're trying to keep our natural areas natural, which is enough of a reason for me personally, but there's many other things that these invasive species impact in our environment, economy, and human health. So educating people, as well as changing our cultural practices. So changing cultural practices has to do with perhaps what you consider beautiful in your yard. And if you're a transplant from somewhere else in the country, what you considered beautiful in your yard, for instance, up north, may not be the best thing or the best plants to have down here in Florida. So changing some of those cultural practices, making different choices, along with changing cultural practices is like what Armando talked about cleaning equipment and machinery. So when you pull your boat out or your kayak out or you're mowing through Caesar weed, all of these things could be potential spread for some of these species. So making sure that you're cleaning your equipment and machinery, or even picking those Caesar weed seeds off your pant legs or your dogs before traveling to a different location. And then we get into more what you might traditionally consider as management, but those other two are so important to consider first. But then physical methods. So that's like hand pulling. One of the best methods for Caesar weed is actually to hand pull it. You can pull down the air potato vine as well and pull up its roots and the bulbils. Biological methods refers to living organisms that control some of these plants. So Armando talked about the air potato beetle and how useful that is to decrease the viability of the plant. And if the plant can't grow well, it can't reproduce well, it can't grow those bulbils, which are one of its main methods of reproduction. So those biological controls are studied for a decade, sometimes 2 decades, to make sure that they're safe to release in our area. And so we do have biological control methods for things like air potato, Brazilian pepper, for instance. And then our last thing on our list is chemical methods. So Some of these plants really only can be dealt effectively with through the use of chemicals. That's not the number one thing we advocate, but sometimes it is the thing that needs to be utilized. And if so, we want to use those chemicals minimally, safely. We want to make sure that we're choosing the ones that are most effective with the least impact to the environment or other species around the target species. Next. So we're going to sort of go back and forth about how you can help, because we're all a part of this. It can't just be these agencies that you see on the screen that are doing it, because invasive species know no boundaries. They don't stay within a certain state park or county park. We all need to work on this together. And there's lots of ways to educate yourself and others through our invasive species talks. I did put the link to our YouTube where our other 6 parts of the series are uploaded, so you can watch any of those other webinars that you're interested in. But all sorts of agencies are doing this education as well, and we've provided you with lots of resources today if you're interested in educating yourself more. Armando, anything else you want to share?
No, and I think we emphasize that we offer a bunch of different opportunities for education as well. So the Flora Mate Naturals program is a great program because it teaches about natural history. So obviously we don't just focus on invasive, but first, if you know what you have, then if you see something that doesn't belong there, it's easy. You might not know the right species, but then you know that that species might not belong there, and that's make you find out more about it. So knowing what should be there, I think is more important than knowing what shouldn't be there. Both obviously are important, but you get the message, I hope. So yeah, take advantage of the Flora Mate Naturals program. They're great. They have one specific for invasive species, but we have the coastal, upland, freshwater system, and they all deal with invasives. So that's just right there. Anyway, that's good. All right. Then about this, there's all opportunities to learn. It's all opportunities to contribute to this as well. And not just in invasive, but also natives. The iNaturalist, that's a very famous app now. If you haven't used it, I encourage you to do so. This app, basically what it helps is for people to post, upload pictures of animals, plants, different organisms that they might know, they might not know. So if they don't know, they basically, you put in that to ask the community. So they have a group of experts, depending on what type of organisms, and they will either say, yeah, you have the right species if you think you know what you have, or they might say, no, you don't. So they will either validate or say, no, this is so. So this helps because also people can see where these species are now. Like I was telling you, some of them are in certain counties, and there are some that's still not in those counties. So if we know if they're showing up, we can act quickly. But if we don't know, then maybe too late. We do have a bunch of books. As a UF, we have for native and not native species, especially with plants. There's many different formats. So you can visit the bookstore. The links are right there. And we also have peer-reviewed articles in our system of publication, which is called IFAS. We also have the link right there, and it has many different information and articles related to invasive plants. In fact, the Aquatic Center of Invasives, I always mess that on. What is Aquatic Center? Center for Aquatic and Invasive Species. They also put links to all these different documents if they do have them, obviously. So you don't just have to go to IFAS, but you can go to the center I was telling you about, and all these documents will be hosted there. So again, what can you do, right? Catherine already emphasized, just being here, you're already learning, so this is great. Participate, keep educating yourself, organize yourself in your community. We do a lot of removals of invasive species as part of citizen science programs. This is one that we did with our office, actually. We were doing a retreat, so we dedicated, I think, a whole hour. So I gave a presentation about the 2 species that we're trying to deal with, and you can see here it's removing the rhizomes of the snake plant. And so it's you can do. I know parks, they do welcome volunteers that want to do invasive removals. They do organize that kind of stuff. So ask your park manager, ask us if you have a group of people, that club or just a fishing club, and you want to do something, good for your community. There's something we can do. We can come and give you a presentation, and we can help you as well. So just, what you're doing. So there's many different ways to help and to learn. Another way as I was telling you, I know it was really good, but FWC has a particular app which called iReport, or I got one, sorry, I should say I got one. I think it was called something different, and they modify, they combine into one. This is a great one because it will give you not just information about that particular species, but it helps us map it and identify what it is. If you look at this map right here in this slide, this is actually from the app, and it's showing you the Brazilian pepper distribution, the distribution of Brazilian pepper in our country. It's from South America, so it's a tropical, subtropical kind of plant. So that's why you see it limited here to some parts of California, Texas, some states around the Gulf, and then Florida obviously is pretty much everywhere. Oh, and Hawaii. So climate change, this might expand the range. Hopefully we'll be able to control it more and that won't happen. But anyway, this app is great to have in your phone. You can report not just plants, but other kind of organisms and also some violation and things like that. So it's a great way to contribute to all this data and also to keep active and to keep learning. So this is another slide. We're showing the app. I just took screenshots of the app so you can see that it's not just for plants, but for other things. So it's very easy. I have it on my phone. Most people now have a camera with a phone, right? So you can have that in your own camera / phone. Oops. But that's how it will look like. So you go into the plants and then you go section, and then from there you have different menus and different suggestions. So it's a great app to have, and everybody should have it. That, yeah, it's plain. All right, Catherine.
And this is a slide on our regional cooperative invasive species management areas, which I had referred to earlier, our SISMAs. So you can also go to floridainvasives.org, which is a great website with lots of invasive information as well. But you can connect with your regional SISMA there. If you're in Pinellas, Hillsborough, Sarasota, or Manatee, ours is the Suncoast SISMA, and I am the co-chair of that regional SISMA. We haven't been doing a lot of work days because, of course, we have COVID affecting us currently, but we are looking forward to starting some more in-person work days coming up. And we are always happy to have volunteers for those work days. And of course, as Armando, I think, mentioned, the state and county parks also accept volunteers to help with invasive species removal as well.
And just to open up for questions, I like to put this quote at the end of this presentation, talking about invasives, because really we've done on this land, right? We borrowed it from our children. This is not a place to us to alter and destroy. It's a place to us to keep, protect, and pass it on. So this is our planet, the only one we have. And if we don't take care of it, well, you can get a picture. And we have destroyed many, many different natural areas. Some of them intentionally, some of them not intentionally. Invasive species are a very complex issue, right? Ballast water coming into ships, things like that. So it's not just people actually release, and sometimes it's an accident, but it is a huge problem, and not just our state, but it's a huge problem to our country, and it's a huge problem globally, and everybody can help. So this is one that not just learning, but you can actually actively help your community, help your county, help the state, help the planet. And with that, I just want to open up to questions. Thank you so much for still being here with us. I know it's a long webinar, but it's a lot of good information.